Everyone, thank you for joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab for today's workshop. If you have any questions along the way for our presenters, you can type them into the GoToWebinar chat box, likely found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any tech questions, you can type them there as well. And without further ado, I will now hand it over to you, Sai.
Thank you so much, Ren. Y'all, we have a lot to get into, so we're gonna get right on into it. Okay, we're gonna get right on in. So, welcome to the workshop today. The title is The Stories That We Carry, and I'm really excited to kind of talk about this topic about implicit bias and creating equitable change within yourselves and your organization, right? So we'll kind of be talking about what implicit bias is. We're not going to spend too much time, well, we will spend a lot of time on the mechanics of implicit bias. So we kind of have an idea of what implicit bias is. I just want to really make sure we're all on the same page, get into what it is, how it works psychologically, and how it's impacting, how it might be impacting you and your organization. Okay. But before we get into the nitty gritty, some of y'all might be wondering, who on earth is this coming on in? Well, hi, I'm a person. My name is Saya. My pronouns are she and they. And yes, I know I have a deep voice. So, some of you may go around and use the wrong pronouns. It's totally fine. Just know there is a hex and you lose about 10 seconds off your life every time you misgender. But do with that information as you will. Who am I? Professionally, I am what we call an empathy coach, meaning that my job is to go into organizations and help leaders of organizations, especially, but really the whole team, develop a sense of emotional intelligence, right? And I don't know, most of us have had jobs throughout our lives, and we've had workplaces that were really sustainable for us, really good for us, and we had workplaces that we kind of were like, oh, I can't be here long term, I can't be here, it's not worth my mental health. My goal is to help organizations and leaders of organizations create a inclusive workplace culture that everyone on the team can thrive, regardless of identity, regardless of difference, and really just honing on everyone's skill set. But how do we navigate conflict together? How do we make choices together? All of that. Outside of that, I have a little bit of a side hustle. I'm a musician. I play multiple instruments, piano, saxophone. I'm also a DJ and a performer. And just for fun, when I'm not doing any of that and I'm tired of talking to people, because I do that all day long, I'm a video gamer. I love going to the movies, and my community is the backbone to everything that I do. Just a little bit about me. But let's get into today. What are our goals for today? So I mentioned this earlier. One, I want to make sure that you understand what implicit bias is, but specifically how implicit bias works. I think we talk about implicit bias more in a lot of things today turn into buzzwords, right? We say implicit bias, or we say gaslighting, or we say these different words that have been used so often that we kind of hear about them, but we don't know the inner mechanisms of how they work. So I want you to understand how implicit bias works and how it may be impacting your decision making. You're going to leave today with one way that you can practice identifying your implicit bias in real time. Now, the key here is that this is a practice, okay? You're not leaving today with the answers, but it's a skill set that I want you to develop. And then finally, three things that you can implement immediately within your organization to start addressing implicit bias in your work, right? So let's get right on in. Also, I know that there is a questions tab, but Ren's gonna let me know when y'all have a pressing question, okay? Because I'm getting used to this here software. So just bear with me, y'all. Bear with me. Oop, I did that already. What happened? Okay, so bear with me. This isn't the most interactive software. So you're kind of doing this on your own, and that's totally cool. Because I'm confident that we're about to have a very similar experience across the board. But I'm going to have a list of words on the left-hand side of the screen. And in your own mind or in your own space, I just want you to think about what is the first thing that comes to mind when you see the following words. Okay. Right? So there's peanut butter and salt and husband and then finally black and. Now, real quick, Probably not rocket science. I'd be surprised to see if someone deviated from the norm, right? Typically we're going to think peanut butter and jelly, right? A classic snack, right? Salt and pepper. Okay, who said pepper? Okay, because they here, salt and pepper's here, right? But you probably thought, right, the seasoning, salt and pepper go well together, right? Husband and wife, very typical. And then finally, black and white, right? So these are very common associations that our brain makes. The goal of this was more for you to see how quickly your brain goes from one item to the next, right? Our brain works in association. We love things that are associated with one another. We love being able to quickly recall and say, oh, peanut butter clearly goes with jelly, salt clearly goes with pepper, right? We have these clear associations, and we can probably do a laundry list of how many associations that are normalized for us, right? This is really important in terms of understanding how the mind works with bias, right? So let's go a little bit deeper. So I'm sure everyone in this call has been to some sort of restaurant, right? And every restaurant you go to, you have a different experience. I actually use this a lot when I'm talking about branding with clients, right? Which is if I say the name of a restaurant, if I give you, right, or even sometimes just the logo of a restaurant, you immediately have a reaction. So for example, whenever I talk to people about McDonald's, okay, there's a few things that show up, right? People either say, ooh, really cheap, affordable food, and some would argue that nowadays not as cheap and affordable, but it's still an affordable option. The ice cream machine probably doesn't work, right? A trope that we are all familiar with, right? You get there and of course, the ice cream machine doesn't work. The ice cream machine never works. And then it's probably not the healthiest choice to go to McDonald's, right? All those trans fats, all those different things, right? Here's another one. Waffle House. Now, I have to say that I've never actually eaten at a Waffle House. I've never really been to a Waffle House. It's just never come up. So this is truly just the word on the street, what I'm getting from the people, right? And that I've heard that Waffle House actually has some good food. It's also a great choice because it's open late. And this is, depending on what you're looking for, it's notoriously dangerous, is the main stereotype that I've heard about Waffle House, is that you never know what's going to happen at Waffle House, but you may get a free show. And by free show, you may get some people yelling at each other. You may get some stuff happening at the Waffle House, right? And depending on what you're looking for, that may tell you if you want to go to the Waffle House or not, right? Finally, the last one I chose on here is Olive Garden, right? Now, who wouldn't love Olive Garden for their unlimited salad and breadsticks? That's the only reason we went. But some would argue that it's also overpriced. And then you got some people that are food snobs that are going to say that it's not real Italian food. So, what's my point in bringing out all of these different restaurants and the possible stereotypes or stories that we've heard about these restaurants? Well, whether you're aware of it or not, these stereotypes, these ideas, these first things that come into your mind actually impact whether or not you want to go to these places, right? And of course, there's a laundry list of reasons why you may choose one restaurant over the other, right? But this is a very low stakes opportunity to understand how implicit bias kind of works, right? Again, Waffle House, I've never even been to, but based on the fact that y'all are telling me that people may fight at the Waffle House, I don't want to go. I want a peaceful meal, right? So just by hearing stories, just by understanding other people's experiences or having our own experiences, we can make inferences about which restaurant we're trying to go to for whatever mood we're in, whatever time we're in, who we're with, right? So this gets us into the cognitive model. How does our brain work? Now, this is very interesting because it's actually the base of a theory in therapy. So I got my degree in counseling psychology originally. So I was planning on going into therapy, and then I was like, no, coaching is more my speed. But we talked a lot about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the type of therapy that, first of all, is most likely to get covered through insurance because it has the most research behind it. It has the most support for being effective in therapy, right? And it's rooted in this cognitive model, which says that our thoughts influences our feelings, which influences our actions, right? If I have a thought, and let's say the thought is a negative thought about myself, right? Or a negative thought about another person, or a negative thought about a restaurant, right? That's going to influence how I feel, right? And how I feel, if I feel strongly enough about something, I'm going to act on it, meaning I'm going to make my decision based on the emotions that come up for me, what I feel in my body. So if there's a restaurant that you suggest to me, and people, I'm sure we've all had this reaction before to something, someone suggests it's a certain restaurant, and you immediately are like, oh no, absolutely not that restaurant. And we do that in the matter of seconds. Like we're really not even conscious of where that feeling came from. It just kind of enters our body and we immediately make a decision. We say, oh no, I hate that place. Or we say, oh, absolutely, I love going there. I have to go. They're so nostalgic. We have to go, right? Let's keep it going. So here's how the cognitive model actually turns out in a person scenario. So speaking of restaurants, I actually love that I chose to do restaurants because I used to be a server, right? And I only trust people that used to work as servers because you get it. If you've ever been a server, you get it. You're dealing with all these different types of people, right? But I worked at a server when I was in college. It was my summer job. And I also grew up, for context, I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. I went to school in Memphis, but every summer I would spend the summer home in Arkansas. So I was in a restaurant in Arkansas. I'm not going to disclose which restaurant it was because I don't know, this might be bad press. So I'm not trying to influence your decision, right? But when I was a server at a restaurant, right, clearly the idea is you want to get the most tips because that is how you're going to, pay your bills, right? Servers don't make a lot of money. We rely a lot on tips because America has a tipping culture, right? So we rely heavy on that. So people are very decisive about who is going to give them the most tips. And one of the things that I was kind of shocked about because it was so blatant and so open was whenever we would get especially a large party of Black people um, coming to eat at the restaurant, people would avoid them like the plague. They would not want to be a server for the Black patrons. They just didn't want to. And so what's behind that? What's behind that? Well, there's a thought or a belief here that Black customers are A, rude, and B, don't tip. So if you get a table of Black people, then they're going to be super rude. You're going to be working twice as hard, and you're not even going to get a tip out of it, is the common thought and belief. And this is widely stated. Mind you, I'm on a diverse staff. So there's a mix of white people, Black people, Hispanic people, all on staff. And most of them carried this belief, right? And so much so they were very vocal about it. So that leads us to a feeling of if I believe that if I have Black customers at my tables that they're going to be rude and not leave me a tip, well, I'm not going to want to serve a party of Black customers. I'm going to begrudgingly do it. I don't want to do that. In fact, nobody wants to do it. In fact, I can't believe anybody wants to have a table full of Black customers, right? And so then there's an action, which is that Black customers are less likely to receive quality service. I'm less likely to be generous and patient if I'm already entering the space into the table with the idea that you're not going to treat me well. I'm already going to have an attitude. I'm already not going to be as charming or as fun to be around or to be your server because I've already anticipated, my body has already anticipated that I'm going to have a negative experience, which leads to my customers also having a negative experience, right? So this is a very basic example of how the cognitive model influences our decision making. Now, mind you, yes, these are conscious thoughts that people are having, but I don't think that people are necessarily conscious of the impact that it has on their own experience or the customer's experience. For example, if I come to you and I have a bad attitude because I'm already anticipating a bad attitude or a negative experience, then it's likely that the customer is also going to return that same energy back to me. And so now we've kind of just entered this cycle of just negative energy back and forth, right? So yeah, that was always stuck with me as an example of how stereotypes still exist in our society, and especially in ways that I just didn't expect. So, what is this thing, implicit bias, right? It refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions without our conscious awareness. Reminder, this is all about what is unconscious. I cannot say that word for the life of me, but we are not aware that our brain is working so fast, right? Our brains actually are thinking a mile a minute so fast that we can't even comprehend how fast our brain is thinking about things, right? If our brains didn't work that quickly, we would struggle as a society. We would always be wondering what something is. We would always need context for everything. So our bias actually is a survival technique that our brains have developed through evolution, right? It's the ability for us to walk outside and not question what everything is. We know kind of what everything is, how everything kind of works, and we can make a lot of assumptions that get us through. The problem comes into play when we're giving that same amount of cognition or lack of cognition to people, right? When we're applying that bias and assumptions to people, right? So again, it's the automatic associations our brains make from the conditioning that we receive. We'll talk about in just a second. What I do want to specify is that everyone has a bias towards pretty much everything and everyone, right? You have a bias to the people you're close to. You like those people a lot. It's probably easy for you to, disregard something someone does because that's your friend, that's your homie, right? Versus a stranger on the street. You may be looking at how they dress or what they're wearing or how they carry themselves to determine whether they're a safe person, whether they are a reputable person, right? Especially as leaders of if you're a leader of an organization, you may be using your bias to understand who you should work with and who you shouldn't, right? And that may be based on a lot of different experiences that you have. But the problem here is that yes, we all have bias, and I'm not questioning whether or not you should have a bias. The question is, are you checking your bias? Are you aware of your bias and how it impacts the decisions that you make on a daily basis? You may make unfair decisions or unfair judgments about people that you won't even notice if you're not checking your bias. And we're going to talk about how you can check your bias in real time in a little bit. But I want to talk a little bit more. How do we go backwards again? I want to talk a little bit more about the impact of implicit bias, right? And a couple of data points for you. There was a 2025 analysis, 2025. So this is a old concept, but in 2025, just last year, there was an analysis that still found that applicants with Black sounding names on average were 9% less likely to receive a callback than applicants with a white sounding name, though the worst offending company showed a bias rate of about as high as 24%, right? Meaning that if my name is more difficult to pronounce, or if it is a Black sounding name, and some of us may be wondering, well, what on earth is a Black sounding name? As someone who grew up with a lot of, and just in the culture, that could be someone. I know people named Daquan. I know people name and there is a lady in my or not a lady, but a girl in my high school class, graduating class. Her name was spelled Angeliqua. That's just how it was naturally spelled, but it was pronounced Angelica. And her graduation was ruined because when she crossed the stage, they mispronounced it. Right, but the idea of those names that sound Black, and I'm just going to be very honest and real. Some people would use the word ghetto or hood, right? Those names are less likely to receive a callback because just the sounding of those names paints a story or picture of a person based on what we believe about people whose names sound like that. Source, which is another research website, found that 49% of all nonprofit chief executives said they did not have the right board members to establish trust with the communities that they serve. This is a common issue we see as a result of implicit bias. We tend to find people that either align with our identities or our values or our cultures, but a lot of times that leads to us choosing board members or choosing leadership that doesn't necessarily represent the communities we're seeking to serve. And so now there's a gap that is hard to bridge over between us, our values and our understanding of the world, and the way that the communities we seek to serve see and navigate the world. And finally, there was a 2024 report of almost 60,000 nonprofits that found that while 47% of all nonprofit staff identified as white, 70% of CEOs and executive directors and 66% of board members identified as white, with Black and Latino executives especially seen as underrepresented. And so here we see that, when it comes to leadership of nonprofits, we're not seeing diversity and in the leadership role at nonprofits. We're not seeing it in the board perspective. We're not seeing it in the on-the-ground organizational perspective, right? And so that, to me, as someone is asking the question, why? Why do we not see that? Why even in 2024, after there's been all this DEI work, right? Why are we still seeing some stagnation when it comes to upward mobility? Here may be a little bit of a answer, right? I like to always talk about the cycle of oppression because it really outlines what's happening in our implicit bias. It's just happening really, really fast. So this is a long cycle, but this is happening in like a matter of seconds. So the first thing that happens is that we see a difference, right? We notice the clear physical or cultural differences in a people, right? Physical differences could be things like your skin tone. It could be what you're wearing. It could be obvious gender markers, right? Or cultural differences, what we value, how we see the world, right? We tend to make pretty big assumptions around political leaning, for example, right? If someone identifies as a Democrat versus a Republican versus a moderate, right? That's a difference that we tend to hone in on. Conditioning, right? Oh, actually, I'm so sorry. I'm going to take this back. I wanted to use the example of, I don't know if any of you could tell with my flag right here, but I am gay. I am gay and I am also non-binary. We're not getting too into the weeds about gender today. But I use that because one thing that I like to talk about is growing up in Arkansas, growing up in the South, and the homophobia. Oh my goodness, they did not like the gays, and that was a lesson I learned very early on, right? So again, going back to difference, one thing that I did notice was there weren't a lot of queer and trans people that were around me, right? So really the only differences I got to see were either in media or in the ways that I heard people talk about queer and trans people. And most of the time when I heard people talk about it, I heard it in barbershop culture. My uncle owned a barbershop. And so it's a very masculine centered space, right? And this is where I received a lot of my conditioning around queer and trans people, because whenever queer and trans people came up in conversation, it was always negative, right? And as a child, right, we are just, and as an adult, by the way, but especially as a child, our brains are really just a sponge. And so we're taking in all the information that people are saying about a notable difference. So people are talking about queer and trans people, a very notable difference, and everything they have to say is negative. Everything is about being a sin. Everything is about it being a disease. Everything is a mental health disorder. Everything is how you can't trust them, right? And so we're paying attention to how people are treated by our communities, but also in media, right? Where are we seeing queer and trans people in media when we're young? Nowadays, very different. But when I was younger, really, you only saw queer and trans people either in a very hyperly sexualized or hyperly stereotypical way, but you never saw them necessarily as like the CEO of a business. You never saw them in a respectable manner. A lot of times, if you saw a trans person, you would only see them in a prostitute or a sex worker role, right? And so those messages we receive. Then we stereotype, right? When we have enough to go off of enough conditioning about a group of people, we'll then create a stereotype for that group of people. We will create assumptions about people solely based on their difference. So I'm making quality judgments about a person. Is that person safe? Do I trust this person? Right? And there's a stereotype, for example, that queer and trans people should not be allowed around children, should not be trusted with children, right? That stereotype has huge impacts of the decisions that you eventually make, right? If you see queer and trans people as unsafe, mentally unfit, that is going to lead to your prejudice, your feelings about a group of people. If you believe, and the problem with stereotyping is not that we aren't going to stereotype. Everyone is going to stereotype. I stereotype. Everyone stereotypes. But the question is, do you believe the stereotypes that you make? Do you make assumptions about people? And then if you do, you're going to have an emotional response. If I find this group of people unsafe or unvaluable, right? I'm going to feel unsafe. I'm going to feel like I cannot trust these people. I'm going to feel like this is not a good fit for a role in my organization, not a good fit for what I want to cultivate, right? And this is what leads to the discrimination or the action. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're still operating in that cognitive model, right? All the thoughts leading to our feelings, leading to action. In this case, the action is discrimination. Our thoughts and prejudice happen quickly, and we often respond without awareness. So without even realizing it, we may avoid certain people. Without realizing it, we may treat people differently. We may approach someone differently. We may not have the same conversation that we have with someone else. And so that was something that I experienced, right? Was this feeling, or not feeling, but this observation I had that people just did not like me because of my gender expression, or did not like me because of how I move through the world, right? And those small things, right? Any action taken out of prejudice is what we call discrimination. Anyone is free to discriminate. I discriminate all the time. It's fair, right? Just discrimination is just as simple as saying I'm not going to that restaurant because I think it's too cheap and too unhealthy, or that's not real Italian food. That's discrimination, right? I'm making a choice based off a prejudice or a preconceived notion that I have, right? But when it comes to people, it becomes more dangerous, right? But everyone does discriminate. And then finally, when you have one group of people that is able to discriminate against another group of people with political and social power, that is when we have oppression. And so we have a disproportionate amount of people able to control the law, or control the social rules that are normalized in our society, and they discriminate against a certain group of people. We see that in the fight for trans rights right now, right, where you see a lot of anti-trans legislation. You see that in the Voting Rights Act that was repealed by, or taken back by, the Supreme Court, and we're still going to see how that turns out, right? So there's a lot of political and social power that comes just through our identities. And that political and social power is also what then reinforces this cycle to continue. So then we recondition the next generation to believe the same things, and the cycle perpetuates and perpetuates and continues until somebody says, let's stop the cycle right here, which is what activists and advocates are trying to do. Right. So again, lay all of this out just so you can understand the mechanisms of why bias exists and where it potentially comes from. Bias really comes from our experiences as young people, right? The ways that people in our communities talked about race, the ways people in our communities talked about gender, the ways people in our community talked about homelessness, right? Inform the way that we see the world, and thereby the way we interact with the world. But these are unconscious thoughts. Very rarely are you making a decision and you think back to, oh, remember that time in third grade? No, very rarely are we doing that, which is why we want to slow down and really understand what's happening in our brains. So I was talking a little bit about the example of being queer or trans, going through the cycle of oppression. And now I just want to tell you a story about a time that I had a few years ago when I got invited to a conference. It was a very low stakes, chill conference, right? Not too big, not too huge. It was one of my first conferences that I got asked to speak at, and I was kind of excited. I got my bio. in the program. I was like, "Ooh, this is so fancy. Look at me go. I'm doing the thing, right?" I love talking into a microphone. And so I go into my room, I do the workshop, and this time I was in school at the time, and it was about youth activism and supporting youth in their activism, which was dope. Only a few people came to my workshop. I think I was at the same time as like a big name, and everyone wanted to go to their workshop, and I was like, fine. So I go through my workshop. As you can imagine, hopefully I'm proving to you through this presentation. It's hard to gauge because I can't see anybody. Um, but hopefully through this presentation, you're like, oh wait, Saya really knows how to talk. Saya knows how to explain things. Saya is really good at speaking to people, right? I'm talented at it. It's what I do. And so I go through the whole workshop. It's great. We get to the end, and there is this gentleman who had been quiet the whole time. He didn't really interact, and then he seemed engaged, but he didn't respond to my questions or anything like that. He wasn't super active. He wasn't in doing. He wasn't really participating in the interactive portions. And so, whatever. We get to the end, and I ask everyone, "What is something you're taking away from today? What is something that's sticking with you?" And yeah, something you learned. And we get to him, and he says, I'm realizing I have a lot to learn." And, I'm a facilitator. That doesn't satisfy me. That's so general. That's so vague. And so be careful what you ask for. Because then I said, well, can you give me a little bit more? Like, can you tell me what do you mean by that? And he says, well, when I walked into the room, I saw you, and you're young, you're black, and you're clearly gay. I ain't hiding nothing. Clearly gay. And I just did not think that I was going to get anything out of this presentation. But you proved me wrong. And, I'm realizing maybe I have my own biases I need to work on. And honestly, he probably said some more stuff, and I kind of blacked it out because I'm still back at, wait. You just looked at me and just determined that my workshop was going to be worthless? Ouch. Okay. So then let's break that down. So he had a thought. He saw the differences between me and him, my age, he named, my race, that he named, or really my skin color is what he named, and my queerness is what he named. He lived a full life. This was an older gentleman. He lived a full life. And again, going back to what I was talking about earlier in the through the cycle of oppression, there are a lot of conditioned beliefs people have around people who are young and inexperienced, people who are black and potentially could be hood or ghetto, and queer people who we again don't necessarily value or see in leadership positions often, right? In spaces of respect often. So he had the stereotype that I don't look like the typical presenter. There was a prejudice he had to when he saw me, he immediately was skeptical of what I would have to say. Would I contribute anything of value? Funny enough, he ended up staying in the presentation, right? He actually pushed, and I think it's because there was someone with him that was like, I really want to sit through this. And so he's like, fine. But he did sit through the presentation enough to have his mind be changed, right? However, it begs the question to me of does that make people less likely to attend my talk just based on how I look? And then finally, there's an oppressiveness to this, right? There's a systematic part. If people are less likely to go into the workshop of someone who is young, black, and queer, does that mean that I am less likely to have my voice heard? Am I less likely to be taken seriously, right? Just based on a few physical characteristics or cultural characteristics. Implicit bias has an impact on us in profound ways. And I like to talk about the personal life of how it impacts us in our personal life, because if we are not applying these things in our personal life, then it's even harder to apply it in our professional lives, right? Really, the change happens in your day to day, in your interactions with your friends and your family and your community. If you're able to identify bias in your personal life, then when you go to your organization, it's the only way that you think. It's the air that you breathe, right? So what tends to happen is we avoid other cultures and perspectives. Why would I go over there? That's not for me. And when we do that, we also avoid knowledge. We also avoid information. This is how you learn what things are offensive and what things are not, right? It contributes to our limited worldview, and we end up in homogenous communities, right? When you take photos of all your friends when you have a gathering, do you all look alike? Do you all believe the same things? We tend to make quick assumptions that lead to missed opportunities, right? That man could have, again, skipped my workshop and he would have never gotten the information I have to give. But how often does he do that to other people? How often do we miss opportunities to connect or miss opportunities to network because maybe we make quick assumptions about people? You tend to have a foot in the mouth type of curse, meaning that you're going to put your foot in your mouth because you're a little ignorant, because you have a limited worldview, because you're not putting yourself out there to understand different ways of thinking. And that will turn people off to potentially wanting to collaborate or wanting to work with you, building trust with you. We have normalized ideas that actually perpetuate oppressive systems through that foot and mouth curse, and a lack of self-awareness or awareness on issues that impact our neighbors and in turn ourselves. For example, where a lot of people are now reacting to I'm not trying to be too political because I don't know everybody in the room, but a lot of people are now realizing that a war in Iran has not just impacts on the people in Iran, but also impacts us through gas prices, through through the cost of oil increasing, right? We're seeing that a lot of times people don't realize the impact that oppression can have, not just on other people, but then ourselves. This is where the idea that there's no liberation for all of us if there's not liberation for some of us, right? None of us are free until all of us are free. That's kind of the intention behind that statement. So how made this impact your organization? How made this show up in your organization? Well, as you mentioned earlier in the statistics, there's limited representation in leadership and decision making, especially when you're thinking about the communities that you seek to serve. If the communities you seek to serve is not represented by the leadership or the team that are, allocating the resources, that are understanding what's the biggest priority, then there is a gap in your understanding and the understanding and needs of the community, right? You want various perspectives. You want to be challenged by different ideas and different folks, right, on your team who can speak to the experience, right, of the people that you're trying to serve rather than making guesses about what feels good. You end up with homogenous work environments that reward one way of thinking. And this is a easy bias that most of us have, right? We love things that confirm our own bias, right? And we want to think our way is the only way. And some of us may even have an ego that says that if you're not thinking my way, then you're trying to say that I'm a bad person. I don't know what I'm talking about. Our ego can sometimes get in the way of good work. And so, like I said before, this leads to gaps in connecting to communities that we seek to serve. And then finally, there could be, is that finally? Nope, not finally. And then there could be a misalignment between organizational values and practice, right? So we advertise one thing, but then our practice is not connected. There's like a disconnect between what we say we value, but then how we're actually presenting and what our brand is to the world, right? And this can also lead to increased burnout and high turnover of staff. So what I commonly see are people that say we want a diverse work environment, we want to, you want to have representation based on the communities that we seek to serve, but then we get these really talented people and they don't stay. And that is because usually it's a cultural issue, right? When I say cultural, I mean organizational culture. Maybe you wanted certain people in, but you haven't built the organizational culture that allows those people to thrive. And I'll give you an example right now. Yeah, I ate that. So let me talk about my example of how I ended up being an entrepreneur, because how on earth? Well, I worked at a community center, and the community center was a queer community center aimed at serving the queer and trans community. I was really, really passionate about that and still am. And one thing that I noticed, because I'm new to Denver, at this time, excuse me. I'm new to Denver at this time. And so I didn't know the whole history, but I did notice that a lot of people would come to me, specifically people in the Black queer community, would come to me a lot to talk about their mistrust of the organization that I worked for. They said, I don't know, I don't feel welcome when I go there. I don't trust them. They've caused harm to the community in the past, and it's hard to get over that. And you know, from an outside perspective, I didn't understand. And so I'm identifying this need, right? I'm understanding that I am getting this community feedback, right? That there's lack of support and lack of feeling welcomed. Well, what do you do when you get that type of feedback? Well, I personally would like to understand the feedback, right? I want to have more information. I need to learn more. So I offered facilitating a focus group with that community, with community leaders, known community leaders, so that we could learn more and develop possible next steps, right? This is clearly a need. We're saying that we want to really be open and making sure that we're welcome to all people, making sure all folks within our community see this as a resource. There's a clear subsect of people in our community that don't see us as a resource, that don't trust us. How do we let's have a conversation with those people? You know, I'm very direct. Let's just talk about it. Here's where the issue came into play. There was a bias and ego from leadership when I brought these ideas to fruition, right? Oh, well, those people are always complaining. They always got something to say, right? Um, and then what kind of took me aback was I was like, okay, we're gonna, you know, come up with a list of possible next steps. And that became this idea of a list of demands. And that had kind of this like defensive connotation to it, right? Are you gonna come up with a list of demands that I now have to adhere to? Oh, now y'all are gonna tell me what to do? So there was this kind of angst around wanting to get feedback. And what I got a sense of was we didn't want to hear all the negative things that people had to say. But I think that is actually the most valuable thing, right? We want to hear the negative feedback. We want to hear where we're not meeting the need, right? But leadership said that I didn't really know what I was talking about. So I went ahead, did the focus group, had a long list of ideas, and people were very energized around like the fact that, oh, you're actually listening to us, you're actually hearing our voice. And at the end of the day, after going back to leadership with what I had found, voices were villainized, meaning that you know, everyone is just complaining, everyone just wants to talk bad about us. There was no follow through with any of the suggestions that people came up with, even the ones that seemed to be low stakes. Resentment eventually builds not just within the community, but also within the team. And eventually, staff experienced very high turnover and a stained reputation that still precedes that organization to this day. To this day, I will network and meet different queer and trans people within the community that either just moved here or been here for a while, and I'm just meeting them for the first time. And that organization's name comes up into conversation, and it's giving, we don't trust them. They've done this, they've done that. I don't feel welcome when I come here. Still the same still the same reputation, still the same brand from when I worked there 5 years ago, right? And so that is an example of how insidious, right? Your bias can actually derail your goals, derail your value, and derail the success of what your organization could be. You're more likely to shut down ideas that don't align with your own. You're more likely to overlook people that you don't see as valuable, right? So some other common examples that we see of implicit bias is tokenizing, placing value on one person's identity rather than their perspective or their skill set, right? It's nice that we have this now we have someone on our team that's of color. We have someone on our team that's queer and trans, and we love advertising. We love talking about how we work well with these folks, but we tend to just use that as a marketing ploy rather than actually listening and valuing the difference of opinion that folks may bring to the table. We may assume competence or professionalism based on identity markers. Going back to being a server, I went at that same restaurant when I was applying and doing my interview. The person that was the owner of the restaurant that did my interview was very shocked to find out that I'm well spoken, very shocked to find out that I speak in complete sentences, right? And so already, right, I'm fighting an uphill battle that I didn't even know I was fighting. Hiring or promotion decisions are framed as cultural fit, right? Who fits well into the culture? But is the culture not homogenous, like we mentioned earlier? If you're already in this kind of homogenous culture, well, so and so is just, they're not going to fit in here. And that's only based on a stereotype or based on a preconceived notion of who the person is, rather than does this person really have something to contribute? Again, leads to a lot of missed opportunities. And this is why we see an unequal access to leadership or visibility in opportunities, right? So going back to why do we still see a disproportionate amount of our board members looking a certain way, or a disproportionate amount of our CEOs and executives looking a certain way? It's because there still hasn't been an equal access to upward mobility and equal access to leadership. Because unfortunately, and I was told this as a child, and this is a very common thing that you hear in Black culture, um, I feel like I have to sometimes work twice as hard to be seen half as much, right? And so there's this uphill battle that some people don't even realize they're climbing, and some people don't even realize they're being the barrier to. And then finally, we may demonize certain cultural needs or traits, right? We see someone's difference, right? And because we are so different, right? Whether that's culturally, whether that's based on our faith, whether that's based on, a lot of different characteristics, it can be easy for us to demonize another way of being. For example, a very common one, I get told I'm very blunt and very to the point. And in cultures where that is, they prefer passivity and um, overt politeness when talking about ideas, right? Those things can clash. And it's not that one is necessarily better than the other, it's that there's a cultural clash that we need to learn to navigate together, right? And that just takes a little bit more work. So, how do you understand your own bias? First things first is I want you to practice regular self-reflection. And this gets into how can you practice identifying your bias in real time, right? When you notice that you have a reaction to someone, when you notice that there's a certain difference that you don't understand or you have a reaction to, I want you to ask yourself, what did you grow up learning about different groups of people? What did you end up learning about race when you grew up? Or did you talk about race at all? What was your understanding of queer and trans people? What was your understanding of homeless people, right? By unpacking the roots and the conditioning that you may have against a certain group of people, you build awareness, which allows you to make better decisions. Another way you can do that is by seeking cultural exposure and immersion. Go to a cultural event that's not yours. Go to and have experiences. Learn more about a group of people. Pause and question the assumptions that you tend to make about another group of people. Have people on your team that are willing to stop you in your tracks and question your decision making. Don't surround yourself with yes people, and replace your certainty you have about other people with curiosity. Ask more questions than you give answers. Some organizational strategies that you can have for your organization if you're realizing that, oh, actually, our organizational culture is a little wonky. We are kind of all thinking in the hive mind. Some things you can consider is ongoing training and facilitated dialogues with your team, right? If there's a specific thing that you're wanting, a specific topic that you're really wanting to be educated on, if you realize maybe you need more open conversation within your team, it may be helpful to have a third party, such like me, come in and do some work with your team directly. Transparent decision making, right? How are decisions made as much as you can legally allow, right? Because there is some things that just cannot be, there are some things that cannot be discussed. But even being transparent about that, right? Being transparent about legally, I can't talk about this. What I can say is this, but people really want to understand how decisions are made, who gets promoted, who gets fired, right? People want to understand your decision making as much as you possibly can. Feedback mechanisms that don't have retaliation, right? So I should be able to give you my experience, give you my feedback without feeling like I'm either going to lose my job or you're going to start treating me differently. A classic case that I had early on in entrepreneurship career was a CEO shutting down someone in a meeting because they said that their idea really stunk, right? I hate that idea. That idea is bad. And I worked with that CEO to kind of go back and be more curious with their staff member. Turns out they actually agreed. Fun fact. So they actually agreed. They were arguing about something that they agreed about, and I had to slow that process down, right? But because there was some type of bias the CEO had towards that staff member, it shut down the conversation immediately. And so, why would I give you any feedback if every time I give feedback, you're just going to shut me down? Regular needs assessment. Are you regularly assessing the needs of your team? Interrupting bias and microaggressions in real time. Now, this is a skill set that can take some time to develop, right? Through some training and some workshops. But when you're able to actually interrupt things and speak up when it matters the most, that's how you as a leader set the tone for your organization's culture. So, 3 things that you can do right now. One is go, how do different communities see us as an organization? And be honest, is there a section of the community that sees you in a negative light? And if so, I want you to lean in. Which community voice is the loudest versus the softest? Who do you hear the most? Are you always hearing the people that are living and donating and want to see you succeed? And are those the loudest voices you hear? And are the voices that are talking about how maybe this isn't welcoming or this isn't serving or this doesn't fit my need, are those softer? Whose voice is being heard more often? Attend an event where you feel like the outsider. Go somewhere where you're not centered and participate, but don't center yourself. Don't make it all about you. This isn't a time for you to go, for example, to a drag show and then get on the stage. This isn't your time to go to a Black Lives Matter rally and just be at the front making it about you. But go somewhere where maybe your culture is not centered, right? That would give you empathy for folks who, are the only person like them in your organization or only like them right in different spaces that you're in. But also, you'll learn a lot about the culture and the community. You'll learn a lot of the questions that you have about a community get answered in those spaces. And then finally, identify a community you wish your organization served better. We can always improve, right? What do the voices of what do the voices of that community say are the outstanding needs? So you could ask community leaders, thought leaders that are, that spill their ideas onto social media. There are so many podcasts, and not all podcasts are built the same, but there are a lot of people talking about the needs of their community. And there are TED Talks, there are other YouTube videos where people, again, are just spilling out a lot of information because they want to see a change, right? But it's important that you as a leader are seeking that information out, not just waiting for someone to spoon feed it to you, right? Final takeaways. Everyone has implicit bias, just as a reminder. This is not about villainizing anyone who has implicit bias, because if that's the case, we're all the villains. It's a human thing that we all experience. But but awareness is a skill that we must develop by slowing down, questioning where our thoughts come from, and how it's impacting the decisions that we're making. Reminder that empathy grows when we slow down and we stay curious. Interrupting bias strengthens people, culture, and our impact, right? Doing all this work is not just so that we can be a good person. Yes, that's awesome for you, right? But it's really so that we can have an impact and see the change that we want to see in the world. If you want to continue this work, just a simple shameless plug. Again, my name is Saya. My organization is Empathy Elevates. You can learn more about my services at empathyelevates.com, where I provide trainings, workshops, keynotes, team building, and dialogue. I do leadership coaching for execs or just anyone on the team that needs it, of helping you identify your own implicit bias in real time. And I'm also a very fantastic event host. I just did a fundraiser and that was really fab. We raised a lot of money for that organization. And if you don't need me to host, but you want some advice on or some expertise on how to design your event to be efficient and still connecting, I also help with workshop design. Okay. So with that, I have made it to the end. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Ren, I'm gonna throw it to you, I believe. If there's any questions, this is a great time for the question and answer portion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Saya. We do have about 5 minutes left, so if anyone has any questions for our presenter, please go ahead and ask now.
Oh, there were no questions that came up.
Not yet, not yet.
Oh, not yet. Does that just mean I did a great job in explaining stuff? Is that just what it is?
I mean, yeah, I think so.
Is that what that means? But yeah, now's a great time. Any questions? Anybody?
I'm not seeing any questions coming through. People are just
Oh, thank you. A
going
fantastic presentation.
so
So, oh, what? Thank you, stranger.
far. Okay, here we go. How do you, oh, no, 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 it's going away.
Not going
How
away.
do you revisit conversations with management when they continue to disregard suggestions?
Ooh, okay. Can you say that one more time? How do you?
Yeah, let me find too
Did you
too
lose
many
it?
things coming through at once. Give me a second.
Oh, we asked and we received, honey.
How do you revisit conversations with management when they continue to disregard suggestions?
Ooh, that is a okay. How do you continue to bring it up? So there's a lot of different ways. I think the biggest thing and the hardest thing to recognize is that, right, there's a clear power dynamic issue, right? Management has all the power, you don't, right? They can fire you, you can't fire them. And so that innately creates this barrier in conversation where maybe we feel like as not management, we have to walk on eggshells. And so one of the things that I do work with teams is balancing that power dynamic and kind of creating that ecosystem. But I would say if you have a good sense of of what your management values, sometimes that's the best approach, right? And that's a very basic like sales mechanism, right? What does this person want? What do they value? And how do I maybe sell it to them in that way? One of the ways that I tend to speak on is, for example, turnover, right? If it's something like, listen, a lot of people are not happy, a lot of people are not, right? And we don't want to lose these folks, or maybe we can prove that it's impacting um, maybe you pre up the case that it's impacting impacting the impact of the organization, it's impacting your goals, it's making your job harder, and you just need this level of support. So I would say like don't give up necessarily. You should continue to try to make your voice heard. If you can do that in a way that speaks to maybe what they value and what they are wanting, that could help and be successful. Also, if you have other people on the team that can kind of rally together and show that you're not the only person with this feedback or with this experience, that can also kind of help balance the power dynamic to see that this is a bigger issue. But if you've tried private conversations, if you've tried conversations in front of the team meetings, so there's a lot of different ways. If I got into the specifics of your organization and your issues, I could give more like ideal feedback. But also at some point there can be this point where you feel like no matter what I say, we're gonna, it doesn't matter. So that's where a lot of people get burnt out and honestly start editing their resumes and finding new jobs, which is the sad part. Is there another question we can answer real quick, Ren?
So many questions now. But we only have, if you have time, we can ask like two more. We can at least start with this next one, which is, could
Yeah,
some of
I
these
don't mind
practices
staying on a little
be
longer.
applied? Okay, cool. Could some of these practices be applied into a classroom setting rather than just a professional workplace setting?
Oh, absolutely. As I said, all of these things apply across the board in your personal life, professional life, regardless. I think all these things apply. And so, for example, in a classroom setting is actually very, depending on like what level, right? I know, for example, when folks work in a high school, and let's say you have someone in the ninth grade that goes into the 10th grade, and then you go into that teacher's lounge and y'all start talking about ooh, child, that Samuel, they are hard-headed, and then you're like, oh wait, I have Samuel in my class. And then, the stereotypes kind of perpetuate there. So there's on that individual level, right? And that's just an individualized idea of like, I already have a preconceived notion of how a student's going to behave, therefore I treat them differently. But you also see that in terms of, yeah, how you maybe even evaluate a student, right? So again, I may be seen as more combative, or I may be seen, in fact, I was told I was making the classroom an unsafe learning environment from other students in my class when I was in grad school, just because I was like, that's racist. Right? So implicit bias definitely impacts the classroom in a lot of different ways. It could impact the way that you interact with your students and vice versa, how they interact with you. Who do you tend to call on? Whose voices are elevated? Does it impact the way that you grade and critique your students? Do you expect more from certain students? Right? I think there's a lot of ways bias can definitely impact the way that we show up, um, and then impact the quality of education that people receive, or vice versa, impact the respect a professor or a teacher receives in tandem. Um, one more question.
Well, let's do one more. What do you think is the hardest part of self-moderating?
The hardest part of self-moderating is the ego. The ego gets really involved. And when I say the ego, I mean there's this part of us that, and maybe that part of us, it looks different in everybody, but there's this part of us that we want to protect. And that's the part of us that feels like a good person. That's all the positive attributes that we have, or, that we're the smart person, or that we're powerful, or that whatever. All of us have insecurities that we're holding on to. And whenever something hits that insecurity, hits that thing that says, oh, am I being a racist? Am I being a bad person? Am I being X, Y, and Z? We tend to be really afraid of that voice. And so instead of confronting that voice or leaning into that voice, we tend to go the extreme opposite. And we say, no, that can't be true. And so the hardest part is that we aren't aware of our bias, and we're really defensive when someone challenges it, right? Some of us, it's really hard to take negative critique and feedback. And so we end up pushing it away. And that leads to a lot of the things that I mentioned earlier. We dismiss other people's feelings, we dismiss other people's thoughts, and those thoughts actually hold value and could actually lead us to success. But because we're so afraid of not being seen in a positive light, or not being liked by everybody, we tend to do ourselves a disservice by just protecting our ego, honestly. So that's the hardest part, is being honest with yourself and allowing other people to be honest with you.
Amazing. Okay. We are officially out of time. So sorry for everyone who didn't get their questions answered, but thank you all so much. This workshop has now come to a close. If you're interested in receiving the recording and materials from today's workshop, you can download them on the bottom of our free webinar page, or email us at program@nonprofitlearninglab.org. Thank you so much for participating. And again, thank you, Saya, for educating our community. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for having me, y'all. EmpathyElevates.com.
Perfect.